Let's talk to Dr. Amar Khan, who's a GP and author, because, of course, the big story is still, and it's still going to trouble Keir Starmer, winter fuel. The winter fuel allowance. There's now going to be a vote on it in Parliament, I believe sometime in the next week or two. Let's find out what's going on. Dr. Khan, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Michael.
Thanks,
how are you?
Very well indeed. Thanks very much for joining us. I mean, a lot of people have not really, I suppose, talked enough about the effects that the withdrawal of this winter fuel allowance is going to have on pensioners. People have said, you know, people might die. They're going to have to choose between eating and heating. And it is a pretty hammer blow, isn't it, to an awful lot of people who are not living well. They're living on sort of £12,000 a year.
Absolutely. I think, I think what we need to be aware of is that, when I was in general practice, and really it's important to understand my background as well and where I come from. I had the privilege of being a general practitioner in Bourneville in Birmingham, where we had the largest elderly population as a proportion of our patients.
Right.
So every winter we were subjected to the crises that occurred, and we used to call it the winter crisis, and that was supported and funded through the government partly and partly by an increase in the work required by the doctors and the social services. So it was putting a huge demand on our work. Now, figures are really interesting because Age Concern have published figures showing that over the last 10 years, a shocking 250,000 older people have died from the effects of cold. And they root the problem mainly as a problem of cold and winter, but also poorly insulated homes. So those are the two main factors that are causing the increase in deaths.
No, of course. And, I mean, as you will know better than anyone, having been a GP, resources at the moment for GPs seem to be less than they were perhaps then. You've got more patients to deal with, probably. A&Es are under more pressure than they've ever been. And so for pensioners who want to see a doctor, it's going to be harder and harder anyway, isn't it?
Of course. And also in winter, we've got more colds and coughs and infections.
Yeah.
And going to the general practitioner or going to A&E can be difficult to start with, but can also be dangerous for the elderly because they can pick up lots of infections which can impact on their pre-existing conditions.
And so what about what is being done? Because I've seen the government has now made a kind of slight sort of repair to what they've originally suggested, because they've given now £400 million back to councils to redistribute that to various sort of pensioners who may be acutely in need of a subsidy of one kind or another. So they've already kind of cancelled the 1.5 billion that they say they're going to make, and they've kind of reduced it by a third.
Sure. I think that's part of the issue. The other part is applying for these benefits. It's such a complicated process that a lot of the elderly who are isolated, who are by themselves, find it impossible to do, so they don't even attempt it.
Right. And also a lot of elderly people now, and my mother died last year at the age of 99, she didn't quite make 100, they're not able to fill out forms, they're not, unless they've got somebody to help them, and many of them don't, because for whatever reason they're alone, they're not able to do those kinds of things.
Sure. And I think a simpler, more easily accessible system will make it easy for them to access it. But it's not just the funds, but in the winter, the sort of their conditions, their pre-existing conditions are going to get worse. The medication they're taking will have a different effect because of the cold and the sort of dehydration that they experience. And interestingly, the commonest cause of death during the winter in the elderly is hypothermia. Yeah. And this will occur even if the house has heating, and that's because of falls. The incidence of falls increases, and of course, an elderly person isolated at home, or even as a couple, if somebody falls, it's difficult for them to get off the ground. They become hypothermic, and that's a major risk factor for myocardial infarction.
Absolutely.
So we see a lot of falls, and I think just looking at the environment, looking at the heating, and also looking at nutrition, because they're juggling between food and heat. And with the price of food going up, the quality of their nutrition is also going to be reduced.
Absolutely. Let's have a look at what Rachel Reeves said the other day. I think you might be surprised by this.
I understand the concerns that the Honourable Lady sets out. The state pension is worth £900 more than it was a year ago, and energy bills are lower this winter than they were last winter.
So apparently everything's fine. It's news to me. Also, electricity bills and energy bills are going up 10%, thanks to a price cap which the Labour Party promised to put on and didn't put on.
Sure. So, I mean, energy bills might be lower than last year. However, they're still significantly higher than they were pre-COVID. So everything has gone up. The cost of living has gone up. And we seem to separate the cost of living from inflation.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it isn't what inflation is doing or what cost of living is doing. It's down to what we have and what that can buy us, and what sort of heating, what sort of food, what sort of basic necessities that can allow the elderly to have.
Yes, I mean, it really is a terrible choice that they've made. The government says, we have to make these decisions, these tough decisions, because there's a £22 billion black hole. Well, they've been spending an awful lot of money, considering they've got a £22 billion black hole. And it seems very unfair to me that they've picked on pensioners to be the one place where they're going to make a saving.
Sure. I suppose it's an easy ask, isn't it, to change things in that area. However, I think,
Pretty cruel, though.
Sorry?
It's pretty cruel, though, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, from a political perspective, I don't want to get into politics, but from a political perspective, it can be quite dangerous. But also not listening to medical advice. I think, during COVID, that happened. And I think we all know that medical advice was given and it wasn't really heard or applied. And I think there is a danger that can happen again, particularly with how we're managing the elderly crisis around the winter time.
Absolutely right. Good to talk to you, Dr. Amir Khan there. Thank you very much indeed, GP and author.